Armatage Candle Company. In today's episode, we're going to cover the basics around blending wax and blending fragrance oil. We'll cover the calculations you need to do for measurements, and we'll talk about the technique. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a little better understanding of exactly what is required of you in order to build these wonderful custom blends of wax and fragrance oil. Let's dive right in. If you recall in a previous episode, our total weight of our candle was equal to the water weight in our candle, if we fill it with water, multiplied by our specific gravity, which we simplified and averaged to say 0.86. We used that to determine that the wax weight of our candle would be equal to the total weight divided by 1 plus the fragrance load. And finally, we said, well, if that's the case, then our fragrance oil weight would equal the total weight minus the wax. And the reason we know that is there's nothing else in the candle. There's only fragrance oil and wax. So fragrance oil plus wax has to equal the total weight of the candle, meaning if we know our wax, we can just subtract it to find the fragrance oil. Well, we can take these ideas a step further and say, well, what does it mean if we want to blend fragrance oil and blend wax? So let's do an example. Let's say after doing all of our calculations here, we end up with a wax weight of 200 grams and a fragrance oil weight of 20 grams. And we could go through all the math, but let's just assume that we arrived at this. Well, let's say that we know we want to blend some items here. Let's say we want to blend our wax. We have 3 waxes that we want to blend. And let's say that we want to blend our fragrance oil. We want to blend 2 different fragrance oils together. And this is going to end up with our candle down here. So I'll visually demonstrate this. We'll have wax number 1. Then we'll have wax number 2. Then we'll have wax number 3. Similarly, down here, we'll have 2 fragrance oils. So fragrance oil number 1 and fragrance oil number 2. Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is determine how much of each wax do we want to blend. And this is a relatively arbitrary item, something that you're going to trial and error, but we have to know these numbers going in. So we will determine the percentage of each item. So I'm going to make 2 tables here. The first table is our wax table. We're going to have wax number 1. We'll have wax number 2. And we'll have wax number 3. So I'm going to split wax 1, 2, and 3, and they have to equal 100. I'm going to say that we will have 20% of wax number 1, 30% of wax number 2, and 50% of wax number 3. And if you notice, these do sum to 100%, 50 plus 30 plus 20. The next step is to multiply by the total wax weight. So our total wax weight was 200 grams. 200 grams. We're going to be multiplying by 200 grams. We're going to multiply these percentages by 200 grams. So the first wax will give us 40 grams. The second wax will give us 30% of 200 grams is 60 grams. That's a 0. And our final number will give us 100 grams. So if I add these together, if I add all of these together, 100 plus 60 plus 40 equals 200. Equals 200. Why does that matter? Well, we said up here, all the way up here, that this blend is going to be 200 grams of wax. So if I'm going to split it up into different waxes, I need to make sure that my 200 grams checks out and I end up with 200 grams of wax. I could move these percentages up and down as I please with later iterations, but for now I'm going to do 20, 30, 50, and it will leave me with 200 grams of wax. And it's really that simple. The third step is to then melt the wax down together. Melt the wax down together, and then continue making your candle as normal. With fragrance oil, the steps are going to look almost exactly the same, so let's walk through our example. So we're going to have two fragrance oils. We have FO number 1, and we'll have FO number 2. Well, how should I split these? I think for FO number 1, I'm going to use 70%, and for FO number 2, that leaves me with 30%. I know that's right because 70 plus 30 is 100%. So that's good. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing we did with our wax, and we're going to multiply this by our total fragrance oil. So I have 20 grams of total fragrance oil, so times 20 grams. And 20 grams times 70%, 20 grams times 70% is going to be 14 grams. And I'll do the same thing for our 30%. That's going to be 6 grams. And if I add these together, you probably guessed it, that's 20 grams. This needs to match what we said we're going to have in our blend. But the third step is to measure these out into your appropriate containers and then continue making your candle as normal. If you're going to add it at 185 to 200, if it's a soy wax blend with paraffin and palm and coconut, whatever you've got in there, just follow your own instructions that you laid out to begin with. So let's clear the board quickly and just do a summary of these steps. So step number 1 is to determine the percent of each component. So if I want to split it 3 ways, I have to figure out what percentage of each wax or fragrance oil I want to use. Step number 2 is to multiply the percent by the total weight of that item. Not the total weight of the candle, but the total weight of the wax or fragrance oil. And then third is to measure as normal. You shouldn't change anything about your candle making process. It's going to look exactly the same as normal. The only difference is you're going to measure out a couple extra items. With wax, you should melt it all together, and with fragrance oil, you should add them all together at the point of time that you want to add fragrance oil to your blend. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to give you a little guidance on what to do with all this new knowledge you have, these equations, this math. So I've got 4 ideas for blending wax and fragrance oil for you to consider. First, there are no rules. There's literally no rules. There's nothing that says that one fragrance goes well with another or one wax goes well with any other wax. And that's kind of freeing, but it's also kind of scary because it means that where do you even start? Well, if you're like me, I just kind of like to start with whatever sounds like it might be interesting and just see how it goes. With fragrance, it's a little bit easier to do that than it is with wax. With wax, sometimes you want to say that, hey, maybe I like a little bit of soy because I like the way it burns, but I also like the hot throw and the stability of paraffin, so I might mix those two things. And there's nothing to say that I can't do that, but there's really nothing saying that I should do that either. Any custom blends we do are really a gateway for our creativity. So the second idea is that you need to prepare to test a lot, actually, because there's a lot of things going on with two fragrances, and a lot of these custom blends, they typically require a little bit more testing, especially when you're trying out waxes. Now, in our example, we mixed 3 different waxes, but it's more common to mix 2 different waxes. And when you pick a percentage of one and a percentage of the other, sometimes the profile, like the finished profile, doesn't look the greatest. Maybe it has sinkholes or cracks, or it's shrunk, or it pulled away from the jar. And in that case, it's easier to make one small adjustment at a time. So you may try blending a 30-70 mix, and the second time, if that doesn't work, you might try a 40-60, then a 50-50, then a 60-40, and so on. It's kind of a line test, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But prepare when you're blending to try out a lot of different things, which means you're going to be doing a lot of testing. The third idea is that not every wax plays nice. You have to remember these commercial waxes come with additives. They're not pure soy, they're not pure paraffin. In fact, they're pretty far from those things at all. They need to be candle friendly, so the manufacturers include a lot of different things in their designs to make them a little bit nicer to play around with. And when you start putting them together, well, sometimes the properties are complementary. They work well together. But sometimes they compete, and sometimes you put 2 things together and it just looks really bad and it doesn't work out. Maybe there's no hot throw. Maybe it cures horribly. It just doesn't look right. It's bumpy, whatever it is. Just beware that you're playing with 2 completely different designs. And the final idea I have for you is that you need to stir and hold. Stir and hold. What does that mean? Well, first, you need to make sure that these fragrances and waxes get time to know each other. Fragrance oil specifically needs some time to stir anyways. We always say 2 minutes around here at Armatage Candle Company. But waxes are kind of the same thing. You're talking about bringing these 2 chemically different properties together, and when it's at a higher heat, give it a little bit of time. Like, give it 30 seconds to 60 seconds at your max temperature, and let that wax just kind of exist together while you're stirring slowly. And you can do this while you add your fragrance oil, but just make sure you give it time. And those are the 4 ideas. There are no rules. Prepare to test a lot. Not every wax is going to play nice. And stir and hold. And that's it. That's the basics around blending. If you have any questions, leave me a comment. I will get to it as soon as I can. If anything was useful, insightful, or helpful, leave me a like. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. I hope you make beautiful candles, and I will see you in the next episode.